Hey you guys, this is Jessica and Noam here for another episode of What's That Sound? Today we're looking at how to get the drum sound of one of the most famous 90s alternative rock songs ever, Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden.
It was produced by Michael Beinhorn. It was drummed by Matt Cameron. It was mixed by Brendan O'Brien. It is just the best song and it's the best drum sound, and we're gonna do our best.
For our drums on this track, we used our 70s vintage Gretsch kit, a Ludwig super light snare drum, and for our cymbals, we had 14-inch K-Sweet hats, an 18-inch K-Dark cymbal, and a 21-inch K-Sweet ride.
We technically also had a second snare that was a Ludwig Superphonic. We'll get into that a little later.
For this track, it's very slow, and so we decided to use a click track, which we don't always do, but for a track this slow, sometimes it's better to get locked in with a click.
So for this sound, the basic miking is like pretty super standard 90s, 2000s rock miking, right? It is all of the usual suspects. And then there is one trick that is kind of a game changer that like helps make this sound what it is. It's not meant to be super unnatural. It's not hyper compressed. It's not hyper bombastic in that way. It's just meant to be a incredibly realistic and also attractive representation of what drums sound like in a room. And just miking drums alone takes us almost all the way there, but we need a little extra push. So let's look at the individual mics. On our kick in, super basic, we have a Sennheiser 421. We've used it a million times on kick drums. It is super punchy. It's really well balanced. For rock kicks, you cannot go wrong with that. It is not like pre-EQ'd like some of these kick drum mics, so you have to scoop out a little bit of mids. We did that with our 1073s. Past that, we put a little bit of compression with a distressor. For the kick out, we used a classic FET 47 clone called an iFET. Adds a ton of body to the kick drum sound. It has a ton of low end that you can EQ even more if you need to. And that paired with the kick in makes a really well balanced rock kick drum sound. If you've watched any of our other videos, you will notice that this is a super common pairing. This is, 50% of all the kick drums out there are using some kind of FET 47 sounding mic and some kind of 421 sounding mic. They just work perfectly well together, and they give you all of the tools that you need to, when you go to mix, add a little bit more low end, add a little bit more high end, kind of shape the sound without having to super over EQ anything. So for our snare drum, again, really simple in the way that we were miking it up, really classic technique. The SM57 on top, SM57 on bottom. We made sure that they were at exactly the same angles and exactly the same distance from the top and bottom. We phase inverted the bottom one because they were out of phase with each other. We added a little bit of EQ on the snare top. We added a little bit of high end and also a little bit of like 100 hertz with our 1073. We added a little bit of compression with an 1176 on the snare top. Past that, really, really classic and simple. Now the part that is not quite as classic and simple is we reamped this snare drum out through another snare drum. So what we did is we took the signal from the snare drum, we stuck a noise gate on it so that it was just the attack of the snare. It just got a little burst of attack every time the snare got hit. We ran that signal out through an Orotone speaker. These are our kind of classic mixing speakers that were really kind of crummy sounding, like they're really, really mid-range sounding. They're kind of small, but they also happen to be exactly the right size to fit directly on top of a snare drum. And they also are passive speakers, so they're quite light, so they can sit on top of a snare drum without completely choking the drum. The drum head you would normally strike with a stick, and that's what would make the drum vibrate. Here, instead of striking it with a stick, you have this speaker that is vibrating on top of it, and it's causing the drum head to vibrate sympathetically. The result is you get the tone of the snare, right? You get the length of the snare without having to hit the snare, and we can run it in real time with the other snare. We did this in an isolation booth, so it was completely separate from everything else, which meant that we could compress it really heavily. Normally, if you put a microphone on a snare drum, the amount of compression you can put on that snare is limited by what else is around it, right? By the cymbals, by the toms, by the hi-hat. All these things get pulled out if you compress the snare drum too heavily. With this snare drum, it's isolated, so we can do kind of anything that we want to it. So we stuck this through a compressor and compressed it pretty heavily so that it brought all of the decay out. We blended it in with the other snare and added some mid-range to it, and it helped just add length to the snare drum in a way that the original snare drum was not quite doing for us. So this is kind of like putting triggers on your snare drum, right? It's a similar concept in that you get a ton of control where you can kind of do whatever you want to this extra sound that's reinforcing the snare. However, it's not a sample. It's a live snare. It's happening in real time. It's not fake. It's really happening. It also gives you the advantage in that you can mic it however you want. In this case, we stuck a 414, and we stuck it about 4 feet above the snare drum. We did not necessarily need a ton of impact off of the snare drum. We wanted the decay, and we liked the sound of that decay a little further away from the snare. Because we didn't have to worry about the bleed of the other drums, we could do that. So for our overheads, we used our Bill Bradley Mic Shop 47s. These are not totally common overhead mics, right? Because they're kind of overkill. These are really high quality tube microphones for vocals. However, they sound incredible on overheads, right? And that's not to say that they sound perfect on cymbals, right? That's not to say that they are the best at recording cymbals better than any other mics, but they capture aspects of the drum kit in a way that if you put a microphone just on the cymbals, it would not capture. We were not looking at these microphones as just cymbal mics. We were EQing them not just like they were cymbal mics. We were trying to get the entire drum kit from these mics and then use our direct mics as spot mics to help reinforce and gain control. Doing it this way, it's part of what gives a really natural sound. It's the sound of the drum kit just as it is in the room. This is picking that up. And then we can kind of augment it from there. Because of that, we had to be kind of specific about the overhead placement. If you stick the overheads spaced pair, if you stick them more over the cymbals, they're not gonna quite get as much impact of the snare drum, of the toms, right? All of these things are gonna be a little bit less impactful. If you move them a little closer to the drummer, we place them almost where they're directly above like the floor tom and the snare drum, they capture a ton of tonality out of that. You sometimes can get away with not using the direct mics at all because they capture such a full and well-rounded sound. And even though they're not directly above the cymbals, because the cymbals kind of travel everywhere, all this high-end information, the cymbals still sound great, even being over the drums. For the toms in the rooms, we'll play them for you, but they're really, really basic. We used 421s on the toms. We used Coles 4038s on the rooms. The rooms got smashed up a little bit with a TG1 limiter that is set to limit, and we had it set with a really fast release. So for the last mic on this, we used a really weird mic, which is called a Muzak microphone. I have no idea where it came from. It looks kind of like a bus driver intercom microphone or like an old-timey talkback button or something like that. It has a really interesting mid-rangey sound. It sounds kind of great on surprisingly great on a lot of things. And we just stuck it like in the middle of the room, just in front of the drum kit. We smashed it up with a DBX 165, which is a really classic compressor. That compressor allows you to have really, really fast attacks. So we compressed it in a way that did not bring out a ton of transient in the sound, right? We had fast attack, fast release, so it brought up all this tone. It did not bring a ton of punch because we knew that we already had the punch part of the sound covered. We were just looking for like this extra kind of crazy energy. It sounds kind of wild on its own. It sounds cool, but it doesn't sound like a natural, if we're trying to make a natural drum sound, that doesn't seem like it would make sense to use. However, if you add just a little bit of it into a drum sound, right? You don't need much, and it just adds a bunch of energy, this kind of kinetic energy to the sound, and if you mute it, all of a sudden you really, really miss it. Finishing touches, we added a tiny bit of reverb, 1 millisecond, a Valhalla room and Avid revibe together. Here's the whole thing. That was Black Hole Sun by Soundgarden.
Thanks for watching, and as always, please let us know in the comments what other songs you'd like to see us break down. We'll see you next time.